Leslie and Zoe, who will introduce themselves as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Leslie Aguilar. I'm a program specialist for the Research Development Corps here at SC CTSI. I work alongside Dr. Page and Zoe, who I'll be handing it off to. Zoe will actually be in charge of the chat, so if you have any questions, please direct them to her. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. I am Zoe Mele, another program specialist with research development. I've been at CTSI for a little over a year, and I work very closely with our other director, Dr. Kayla Delahaye, on our team science initiatives and activities. So you'll be seeing me as applicants, mostly on the team science side. So thank you, everybody, for joining.
Okay, so Leslie's going to moderate the slides, and so maybe next slide, let's start off. Okay, so this year we have two funding mechanisms for our pilot grants. The first is a standard pilot grant, which we'll talk about in more detail, but it's funding up to $50,000. And the second RFA is for a multidisciplinary grant, which is funding up to $125,000. Next slide. So the purpose of our pilot awards is to broadly support the development of new clinical and community-based research projects. Generally, the support would go to the collection of initial data that's going to be important for generating data so that you can submit for extramural funding. So this is specifically to the areas of clinical and community and health systems research. So preclinical, cell, molecular, and animal proposals are not allowed. So this would also be for the other purposes for developing and testing new approaches and or tools to increase the speed, efficiency, safety, and quality of clinical community health outcomes and implementation research. Okay, so that's the purpose of both proposals. We have a two-stage submission process, and what that means is that we call for letters of intent first. The letters of intent would be submitted by the deadline of September 22nd, and those letters are one page, and they will be peer-reviewed by an executive committee. And from those letters of intent, up to 15 would be selected to submit a full proposal. And so this would be the full proposal that would follow the guidelines that we'll talk about. And the full proposal would be due November 13th, 2023. Next slide. Okay, so once the letters of intent are selected, the proposals that were selected to submit a full proposal from the letters of intent, those projects would be expected to consult with an SC CTSI core for advising on the proposal. So the executive committee that reviews the letters of intent, we would be providing insights on which cores might be particularly useful for proposal development. So for example, some proposals might benefit from use of the biostatistical core. Some might benefit from advice and recommendations from our community engagement core. And so that would be part of the process as the letters of intent, if the ones that are selected would be able to get advice on the proposal that they will be generating from one of the specific cores that may be particularly helpful for their specific area. Okay, so I'm going to talk specifically about the two different grant mechanisms that we are funding this year. The first of which is the standard pilot grant. And so priority for the standard pilot grant proposals will be they're really intended for projects that demonstrate a clear path for achieving extramural funding or direct implementation improvements in clinical and community engaged research processes. What that means is the priority is given to pilot proposals that articulate clearly how the generation of data from that pilot proposal is going to be used to initiate and secure extramural funding and continue this research. So why is the research important, and how is it going to be continued with larger extramural funding mechanisms? Secondly, a commitment of the principal investigator to a career in research is considered a plus. And all of the proposals that will be reviewed by the CTSI will be evaluated in an NIH-style peer review process. For those of you that aren't familiar with that, it's a process by which we have 5 different criteria that we utilize in order to evaluate the grant proposals. We have significance, innovation, investigative team, environment, and the overall approach, and then an overall impact score. So those are the 5 categories that the proposals are evaluated on. And the NIH style rubric is a 1 to 9 scale. So 1 is the best and 9 is the worst. And so that's the review process that we're going to be utilizing for both grant mechanisms. So eligibility is full-time faculty members at USC and CHLA as of the date of the letter of intent submission. So that is September 22nd, 2023. So full-time faculty members are eligible to be PIs. Additionally, the principal investigators have to devote at least 30% of their professional effort to research. That doesn't mean it has to be to this specific project, but overall, the principal investigator needs to demonstrate that they have sufficient time to devote to research. And that is defined as at least 30%. So a confirmation of this commitment to research is required by letter from the department chair, confirming that the specific time will be made available for the PI to complete their research, while they're also fulfilling their other clinical and teaching commitments. So other members of the team could include postdoctoral fellows, residents, students, and community members. These can all be co-investigators, but they cannot be principal investigators. International faculty who are non-US citizens or permanent residents must have a USC appointment and hold a visa to allow them to remain in the United States long enough to complete the proposed project, which is 1 year. So the budget for the standard pilot proposals are up to $50,000 for a 12-month period. Cost share is not required for these particular grants. Okay, so that's the standard grant mechanism. I'm going to go into some details about the multidisciplinary pilot grant, and then we'll have plenty of time to answer questions. Okay, so for a priority for the multidisciplinary grant projects is projects that will engage multiple investigators across disciplines throughout the university. And this is for really generating a new research partnership. So these are projects that require multidisciplinary expertise, and that's going to be required to be articulated in the grant proposal. A clear path to sustaining extramural funding, again, is really a requirement or a priority for this grant mechanism as well. One of the differences in the multidisciplinary grant from the standard grant is that we really want proposals that are going to be able to initiate a rapid, bold metrics over a 6-month period. So we want projects that are going to move very quickly. So these are projects that have to be very well thought out. And so we require, as I'll talk about on the next slide, that the 6-month timeline and the 12-month timeline are very well defined, and the goals and deliverables that will be achieved by 6 months will need to be demonstrated in a progress report at that time before the rest of the grant funding is awarded. So really 6-month progress report is required for this grant mechanism. And lastly, a commitment of the PI to research is considered a plus. Next slide. Okay, so eligibility here, similar to the standard grant mechanism, full-time faculty members at USC and CHLA are eligible to apply. This grant mechanism requires at least 2 PIs, so a minimum of 2 principal investigators, but it can have more than that. These principal investigators have expertise that would complement each other and contribute to the multidisciplinary approach that's proposed in the project. Each PI must devote at least 30% of their professional effort to research, and each PI has to confirm this with a letter from their chair. Again, postdocs, residents, fellows, students, and community members can be included as co-investigators, but only full-time faculty members are eligible for as a PI. And international faculty are eligible in the same way they were for the standard proposal, as long as they have a USC appointment and they're going to be in the United States long enough to complete the project. Okay, so the budget is a little bit different for the multidisciplinary grant. So in this case, applicants can request up to $125,000 for the 12-month period. In this case, there's some cost share. So it's composed of a 4-to-1 ratio of funds from the CTSI to funds from the investigator's home department, school, or institute. So for example, if the applicants are requesting $125,000 in their budget, $100,000 of that budget would come from the CTSI funding, and $25,000 would need to come from the home department, school, and/or institutes of the participating investigators. So it doesn't have to come from one department; it can come from each. It can be shared across the principal investigators, but there does have to be a cost share from the department, school, or institute of the PIs. And applicants must include a letter or letters of commitment specifying the amounts and sources of that cost share. As I mentioned earlier, we really want proposals for this multidisciplinary award to be fast moving. And so the initial award is made for the first 6 months of the budget. So there needs to be a very specified timeline and budget for the first 6 months. And then for the full 12-month period, the funding will be contingent upon meeting the milestones that are described within the 6 months. So the 6-month progress report is required in order to get granted the second 6 months of funding. And those are the main slides that we have. These are our contact information. So if you have any questions that you didn't think of today and want to email us, please feel free to do so. And then I'd like to save the rest of the time for any questions that you have.
Katie, this is Zoe.
Yeah.
We do have a couple questions in the chat to start off, but I was also wondering if I could share a press release that CTSI released earlier this year regarding our fall 2022 awardees, so that people have more examples.
Yeah, that would be great. Do you want to do that first?
Sure. So I'm just sharing in the chat a press release from CTSI this year. Within this press release is a list and a short summary on our current awardees, because this is a fairly newer mechanism. It's our second year using this funding mechanism. So please feel free to view that press release for some guidance for examples of past awardees. And if you want, Katie, I can begin reading questions in the chat that we have.
Yeah, sure. And I just want to make sure people are aware that, feel free to ask questions or ask questions in the chat. So either whatever you feel comfortable with. Yeah, but go ahead, Zoe.
But before I say anything, Leslie, can you please stop the recording for questions?